The carrier limped into Pearl Harbor trailing black smoke, her deck scorched, a hole punched through 4 levels where sailors had burned alive 2 weeks earlier. Engineers took one look and said 90 days to repair her. They were given 3. The man who brought her home, a quiet farm boy from Iowa, walked off that ship and straight into the office of the Pacific Fleet's commander to explain what had happened in the Coral Sea. 2 days later, that same commander sat down and wrote a letter praising him as an excellent fighting officer. He recommended him for promotion. He recommended him for a medal. 4 months after that letter was written, the man was gone. Not fired, not court-martialed, not disgraced in public, just quietly sent north into the fog of the Aleutian Islands, where no enemy carrier would ever sail and no battle would ever be fought again. His name was Frank Jack Fletcher. He had just won 3 carrier battles in a row, a record no other American admiral could match. So who decided he was no longer worth keeping? And why does the official record still get this story wrong? He was born in 1885 on a farm outside Marshalltown, Iowa, 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean he would spend his whole life protecting. Frank Jack Fletcher grew up quiet, plain-spoken, and unremarkable in the way that men who do not need to announce themselves are often unremarkable. He went to Annapolis because an uncle had gone before him. Nobody watching him graduate in 1906 would have guessed that this soft-spoken young man would one day carry the weight of the entire Pacific War on the decks of 2 or 3 ships. There was nothing in his manner that suggested destiny. He did not seek out attention, did not court the newspapers, did not surround himself with the kind of officers who talk about their own careers over dinner. Men who served under him would later describe him the same way, again and again, as steady, not brilliant in the way a headline wants brilliant to look. Steady. The kind of man you wanted standing next to you when the deck was tilting and the smoke was rolling across the horizon, precisely because he did not seem capable of panic. The first sign of who he actually was came in 1914, in the port of Veracruz, Mexico. American forces had occupied the city, and Fletcher, a young lieutenant, was given command of a transport ship called the Esperanza. His orders were simple and terrifying. Sail into the harbor under fire and bring out the civilians trapped in the crossfire. He took that ship in. Rifle fire raked the hull. Rounds sparked off the deck plating and punched through the wheelhouse. It was hit more than 30 times. Below him, in the hold and along the rails, terrified families pressed together, women clutching children, old men clutching whatever they had managed to carry out of their homes before the shooting started. He held his course anyway, loaded refugees under gunfire, and brought out over 350 people. Then, because the job was not finished, he took a train of refugees through hostile territory believed to be mined, under nothing but a flag of truce and his own nerve. For that, the United States government gave him the Medal of Honor, not a battlefield promotion, not a mention in dispatches, the highest decoration this country has ever given a fighting man. He was 29 years old. 4 years later, in the First World War, he won the Navy Cross, commanding a destroyer through submarine-infested waters, escorting convoys across an ocean, where a single mistake meant hundreds of drowned men. This is worth remembering, because in the years to come, men who never left a desk in Washington would call Frank Jack Fletcher a coward. Hold on to who he actually was, because that judgment did not come from the man himself. It came from what happened to him after 1941. By December of that year, Fletcher was a rear admiral, and the war had just begun. Pearl Harbor was still burning when he was given command of a task force built around the carrier USS Saratoga and sent racing across the Pacific with one mission: relieve the Marine garrison fighting and dying on Wake Island. He was closing the distance, the plan taking shape, when the recall order came. Not from Fletcher, not from Nimitz, who had not even arrived yet to take command of the Pacific Fleet. The order came from Vice Admiral William Pye, who was running the fleet in the gap between commanders. Pye called the relief force back. Wake fell 3 days later. Pye himself admitted years afterward, in print, that the decision had been his alone. But Fletcher was the man steaming toward Wake when the order came, and the Marines who lost that island never forgot that the Navy turned back. The stink of it settled on Fletcher's name and stayed there, whether it belonged to him or not. That is how a reputation begins to form in wartime, not always through a single decision a man actually makes, but through where he happens to be standing when someone else's decision goes wrong. Fletcher would spend the rest of his career learning that lesson over and over, and he would never quite figure out how to defend himself against it. Then came January of 1942, and the raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, and here the story that would follow Fletcher for the rest of his career took its first real shape. Before going in, Fletcher spent what Admiral Ernest King, watching from Washington, considered far too much time refueling his destroyers. King fired off a message so sharp that one of Fletcher's own cruiser commanders read it aloud and told him flatly that it was the stinkiest message he had ever seen sent to a flag officer. Fletcher's answer was 2 words: "I'm not perturbed." But King was. And the uncomfortable truth is that the fuel question was not invented out of nothing. Fletcher really did top off his ships again and again, sometimes when the logs suggest they did not strictly need it. To the men judging him from a desk 6,000 miles away, it looked like an admiral who checked his fuel gauge before he checked for the enemy. Nobody in Washington asked what it looked like from the bridge of a carrier that could not be replaced. 4 months later, that question would answer itself in the most violent way possible. In early May of 1942, Frank Jack Fletcher commanded American forces at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first battle in the history of warfare fought entirely between carriers, in which the opposing fleets never once caught sight of each other across the water. He had 2 carriers under his flag, the Yorktown and the Lexington, against a Japanese force built around the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, escorted by the light carrier Shoho. And in the middle of that battle, Fletcher did something that revealed exactly what kind of commander he actually was. He was not an aviator. He had never worn the wings. So when Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch arrived, a trained aviation officer and an Annapolis classmate from Fletcher's own year, Fletcher handed him direct tactical control of the carrier air operations. He kept overall command of the battle. But he let the man who understood carrier aviation run the carrier aviation. That is not the decision of a man protecting his own authority. That is the decision of a professional who understood that the weapon in his hands was too important for his own pride. The battle itself was 2 days of confusion, both sides firing blind across hundreds of miles of open ocean, each admiral trying to guess where the other man's carriers were hiding before the other man guessed first. On the first day, American scout reports were garbled, and a strike meant for the Japanese fleet carriers was launched instead against a lesser force. On the Japanese side, their pilots made the same kind of mistake in reverse, sinking the American oiler Neosho and the destroyer Sims, while the real prize, the American carriers, sailed on untouched. This was not incompetence. This was the fog that every carrier commander of 1942 was learning to fight inside, often for the first time. Picture what it actually meant to command inside that fog. No satellites, no radar reliable enough to trust completely, nothing but a handful of scout planes scattered across a patch of ocean larger than most countries, each pilot squinting through cloud and haze and trying to read the silhouette of a ship from 4,000 feet up while his fuel gauge ticked downward. A single garbled radio call, a single misread contact report, could send an entire strike of dive bombers and torpedo planes hundreds of miles in the wrong direction, burning fuel they could not get back, flying toward an empty patch of sea while the real battle waited somewhere else entirely. That was the instrument Fletcher was playing, and there was no rehearsal for it. Nobody alive had ever fought a battle like this one before, because no one had ever fought a battle where the two fleets never saw each other at all. When the fighting found its mark, American aircraft sank the Shoho outright, producing the famous radio call that scratched one flat top off the board. They put bomb hits into the Shokaku that knocked her out of the war for 2 months. They so gutted the air group aboard the Zuikaku that she could not fight either, even though her flight deck was untouched. Because both of those Japanese fleet carriers were suddenly unavailable, the enemy called off the invasion fleet aimed at Port Moresby, in New Guinea, a foothold that would have brought Japanese bombers within range of Australia itself. 4 weeks later, at Midway, the Japanese would go into the most important battle of the Pacific War, with 2 fewer carrier decks than they had planned on. That is the debt Coral Sea paid forward, and very few people watching from the outside understood it at the time. What they understood instead was the price. The Lexington took 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs. The damage at first looked survivable. Fire crews had the worst of the blazes under control within an hour. Men were laughing on the flight deck, passing around sandwiches, believing the old ship had come through it again. Then, at 12:30, deep inside her hull, aviation fuel vapor that had been leaking unseen through cracked lines found a spark. The explosion rolled up through 8 decks at once. More explosions followed, one after another, as the fires reached ammunition lockers and more fuel tanks, each blast throwing men into bulkheads and knocking out whole sections of lighting until the ship was fighting fires in darkness. 216 men died aboard her, most of them not in the initial attack but in those fires that followed, trapped below decks in compartments that had been safe an hour earlier. The destroyer Phelps finally put 2 torpedoes into her to send her down for good, and men still aboard the sinking carrier gave 3 cheers as she rolled over, a strange and very human sound to come out of a funeral. Of the nearly 3,000 men she carried, the Navy saved more than 2,700, pulled out of the water by nearby destroyers in one of the most orderly abandoned ship operations of the entire war. But the ship herself, one of only a handful of fleet carriers America possessed in the entire ocean, was gone. Coral Sea was, by any honest measure, a strategic American victory. It saved Australia's doorstep and crippled 2 enemy carriers before the battle that would decide the war. But in the mind of Ernest King, sitting in Washington counting hulls, none of that mattered as much as one simple fact. Fletcher had lost the Lexington. And King, the historian Walter Borneman would later write, would never forgive him for it. Not after Midway, not after anything that came next. The grudge had taken root, and it would not stop growing until it had taken everything Frank Jack Fletcher had left to give the war. News of Coral Sea reached Pearl Harbor within days, and with it came a strange irony that would define everything that followed. Chester Nimitz, the quiet and deliberate commander of the Pacific Fleet, sat down and wrote to his superior in Washington with nothing but praise. Fletcher, he said, had done a fine job. He had exercised superior judgment. He was an excellent seagoing fighting officer, and he deserved to be promoted to Vice Admiral and decorated for what he had done in those 2 days of blind, groping combat. King, reading that recommendation from behind his desk in Washington, was not so sure. He had already told Nimitz in person that he had reservations about giving Fletcher such an important command in the first place. Reservations he did not fully explain and did not need to, because rank alone gave him the standing to simply let them sit there, unanswered, hanging over Fletcher's next assignment. The loss of the Lexington sat in King's mind like a stone that would not dissolve, no matter how many Japanese carriers had been damaged in exchange. Still, for now, Nimitz's judgment held. Fletcher would keep his flag. There was no time to argue about it further. A far bigger battle was already forming in the intelligence reports crossing Nimitz's desk, and it was going to happen within the month. The Japanese were coming for Midway Atoll, and American codebreakers had read enough of the enemy's plan to know it. For weeks, a small team working in a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor had been picking apart intercepted Japanese naval signals, piecing together fragments of a code name, AF, until they finally confirmed through a deception of their own that AF meant Midway. It was one of the great intelligence triumphs of the war, and it meant Nimitz would go into the coming battle knowing roughly when and where the enemy intended to strike, an advantage no fleet commander could count on twice. But knowing where the blow was coming did nothing to change how few ships he had to meet it with. Nimitz needed every carrier he had left, and that meant Fletcher, still flying his flag from the Yorktown, the same ship that had come back from Coral Sea trailing oil and scorched black across her flight deck. The Navy Yard at Pearl Harbor had told Nimitz the ship needed 90 days in dry dock to be made whole again. Nimitz did not have 90 days. He gave the yard workers 3. They swarmed over the wounded carrier around the clock, welding steel plate over a bomb hole that had punched clean through 4 decks, patching what could be patched and leaving the rest for later. And somehow, impossibly, they had her ready to sail by the end of May. Fletcher would command the senior task force at Midway, built around that patched-together carrier. Under him, commanding a second task force built around the Enterprise and the Hornet, was Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cruiser officer who had never commanded carriers in battle before in his life. He was there because William Halsey, the aggressive and popular admiral who should have held that command, was lying in a hospital bed in Hawaii, his entire body inflamed with a skin condition so severe he could not sleep and had lost 20 pounds in a matter of weeks. Halsey recommended Spruance to take his place. Nimitz agreed, and so a man with barely a week's worth of experience around carrier operations found himself standing on a bridge on the morning of June the 4th, 1942, about to take part in the most consequential naval battle of the 20th century. The plan called for Fletcher to hold Yorktown in reserve while Spruance's force struck first, because the intelligence suggested the Japanese might split their 4 carriers into separate groups, the way they had at Coral Sea. It did not happen that way. All 4 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, were found together, but the morning did not begin well for the Americans. Squadron after squadron of low, slow torpedo bombers went in first, flying straight into a wall of Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire with almost no cover of their own. Torpedo Squadron 8 off the Hornet attacked alone, all 15 aircraft shot down, and only a single pilot, treading water for hours afterward, survived to tell anyone what had happened. Squadron after squadron from the Enterprise and the Yorktown met the same wall of fire, and almost none of their torpedoes found a target. For a terrible stretch of the morning, it looked as though the attack was failing completely. The Japanese fighters pulled down low to the water to finish off the slaughter of the torpedo planes, their formations scattered and their fuel and ammunition running low from the effort. And then, at around 10:25 that morning, dive bombers from both American task forces arrived high overhead, completely unopposed, because every Japanese fighter had been pulled down to sea level to deal with the torpedo planes, one of the great coincidences in the history of naval warfare. Yorktown's own dive bomber squadron tore into the Soryu with devastating accuracy. Enterprise's aircraft, arriving at almost the same instant from a completely different direction, shattered the Akagi and the Kaga in the span of a few catastrophic minutes. In the space of about 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were burning wrecks, doomed even though they had not yet sunk. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, still afloat and still dangerous, launched everything she had left at the American fleet, and her aircraft found the Yorktown. 3 bombs tore into her flight deck and hangar in the first wave, and for a while it looked as though the ship might be finished right there. But her damage control crews, the same men who had rebuilt her in 3 days at Pearl Harbor, worked with a kind of stubborn discipline that bordered on defiance. Within roughly an hour, the fires were out, the holes in the flight deck were patched with steel plate, and Yorktown was making 19 knots again, launching fighters as though nothing had happened. The Japanese search planes reported an entirely different, undamaged carrier back in action, and Hiryu launched a second strike believing they were about to sink a fresh target. That second wave found Yorktown again in the early afternoon and put 2 torpedoes into her port side. This time the damage was fatal. The ship listed hard, power failed throughout the hull, and with no way to correct the list or fight the growing flood below decks, the order went out to abandon ship. Men went over the side in life vests, dropping into an ocean slicked with fuel oil, and destroyers moved in through the debris to pull them out one by one. The ship lost power and went dead in the water, unable to launch or recover another aircraft. And here, at the exact moment when a lesser man might have clung to his authority out of pride, Frank Jack Fletcher did something almost nobody remembers today. With his own flagship crippled beneath him, he did not try to hang on to command of a battle he could no longer see or direct. At 6:11 that evening, he shifted his flag to the heavy cruiser Astoria, and he sent Raymond Spruance a signal of only 4 words: "We will conform to your movements." He handed over command of the most important naval battle in American history to the only other man in position to fight it. At the exact moment, 3 of the 4 enemy carriers were already burning hulks. Spruance himself would say later that by the time Fletcher passed him the battle, it was, in his own words, already won. Spruance went on to make the decisions that history would remember as brilliant. He pulled back that night to avoid a surface battle with Yamamoto's battleships in the darkness, and he returned at dawn to finish the fight, sinking the Hiryu and completing the destruction of Japan's entire strike force in a single day. Those calls were his, and he earned every bit of credit for them. But the battle he inherited had already been decided in its first 6 minutes, largely by aircraft that had flown from Fletcher's own carrier. 2 days later, a Japanese submarine found the crippled Yorktown still under tow and finished her with torpedoes. The destroyer Hammond, lashed alongside trying to keep her afloat, was struck by the same spread and broke apart in less than 4 minutes, taking roughly 80 of her crew down with her, some of them killed not by the torpedo itself, but by their own depth charges detonating beneath the men still swimming in the water. It was a brutal reminder that in 1942 there was no clean way to lose a ship, and no guarantee of a second chance for the men aboard her. Fletcher had commanded the American side of the most important naval victory of the war, and in the months to come his name would begin to quietly disappear from how that victory was told. There was no time to dwell on it. By early August, barely 8 weeks after Midway, the United States launched its first offensive of the entire war, landings on the islands of Guadalcanal and Tulagi in the southern Solomons. The men who fought there called it Operation Shoestring, because everything about the plan was thin, rushed, and undersupplied. Fletcher, now a vice admiral, commanded the entire covering force, Task Force 61, with 3 irreplaceable carriers under his flag: the Saratoga, the Enterprise, and the Wasp. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the transports carrying the Marines ashore. Major General Alexander Vandegrift commanded the 1st Marine Division that would do the actual fighting on the beach. Days before the landing, aboard the Saratoga, the 3 commanders sat down together and argued over how long the carriers could stay tied to the invasion beaches, and the meeting did not go well. Fletcher told them plainly that his ships could not remain in range indefinitely. He was thinking 2 days. Vandegrift, a Marine general about to put his entire division ashore on an island nobody in Washington could reliably supply, pushed back hard, telling Fletcher his men needed at least 4 days to get equipment and ammunition and food ashore in any real quantity, and that abandoning them any sooner than that would leave them stranded with barely enough to survive, let alone fight. Turner backed the Marines. Fletcher, reluctantly, and by most accounts without much grace in how he said it, agreed to 3. It was not a warm meeting, and it left Turner with the distinct impression that the carriers would leave the moment Fletcher judged it convenient, an impression that would matter enormously in the days ahead. The landings went ashore on the 7th of August, into thick jungle heat and driving humidity that soaked a man's uniform within minutes of setting foot on the beach. Landing craft ran aground on unmarked reefs. Crates of ammunition and rations sat stacked 3 and 4 high along the waterline because there were not enough working parties to move them off the sand fast enough, and every hour those crates sat exposed was an hour a Japanese air raid could turn them into scrap and fire. And like every amphibious operation ever attempted, The unloading fell behind schedule almost immediately. By the evening of the 8th, with cargo still stacked on the beaches and half the transport still full, Fletcher sent the message that would follow him for the rest of his life. His fighter strength, he reported, had dropped from 99 aircraft to 78 in barely 2 days of near-constant combat, a loss of more than a fifth of his air cover. Japanese torpedo bombers were operating in growing numbers throughout the area. He recommended immediate withdrawal of the carriers to refuel, and he asked that tankers be sent forward at once. He weighed 3 carriers, 3/4 of the entire fleet carrier strength the United States possessed anywhere in the Pacific Ocean, against an unloading operation that was already behind schedule and showing no sign of catching up soon. His superior, Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, approved the request from further south, and Fletcher pulled his 3 carriers away from Guadalcanal that night, steaming south into open water to refuel his destroyers and put distance between his flight decks and the Japanese bombers flying down from Rabaul. What happened next has haunted the reputation of Frank Jack Fletcher for 80 years. In the blackness of the early morning hours of the 9th of August, a Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa slipped down the channel that sailors would soon start calling Iron Bottom Sound and fell without warning on the Allied cruisers screening the invasion anchorage. Mikawa's cruisers came out of the darkness in a single column, running without lights, and the first the Allied lookouts knew of them was the flash of searchlights sweeping across their own decks an instant before the shells arrived. In roughly 32 minutes of close-range night gunnery and torpedo fire, the Japanese sank 4 heavy cruisers, the Vincennes, the Quincy, the Astoria, and the Australian cruiser Canberra. Men who survived it described a night sky lit orange from burning ships, the water full of oil and wreckage and other men calling out in the dark, and the strange, sudden silence when the Japanese column, its work done, simply turned and vanished back the way it had come, rather than pressing on to destroy the vulnerable transports still unloading at the beachhead. More than 1,000 Allied sailors died in that half-hour alone. It remains, to this day, the worst defeat the United States Navy has ever suffered in open water. The logic of blame was immediate and brutal. Fletcher had pulled the carriers away. The very next night, disaster struck the men left behind. The Marines sat on that beachhead for months afterward, short of food, short of ammunition, watching the horizon for a navy that had gone over it and not come back. They invented a bitter, sardonic decoration of their own, a mock medal they called the George Medal, depicting a Navy sleeve dropping a hot potato into a waiting Marine's hand, with the motto, "Let George do it." Kelly Turner, who had backed Vandegrift's demand for more time, never forgave Fletcher for pulling out early. Years later, he would use a single, devastating word to describe what Fletcher had done: desertion. 2 weeks after Savo Island, Fletcher had the chance to answer his critics the only way that mattered: in battle. On the 24th of August, Admiral Yamamoto sent a force built around several carriers to reinforce Guadalcanal, including the light carrier Ryujo, sailed forward almost as bait to draw American attention. Fletcher's dive bombers off the Saratoga found her and sent her to the bottom that same evening. The Japanese struck back hard, putting 3 bombs into the Enterprise in the space of a few seconds, the explosions ripping through her hull and starting fires below decks, one of which touched off an ammunition explosion that killed roughly 74 men in an instant, most of them trapped in a compartment with no way out. Smoke poured off her flight deck, and men topside braced for the order to abandon ship. It never came, but the Enterprise had been drilled hard, and her damage control teams were good enough that she was recovering her own aircraft again within about an hour of being hit, her crew fighting fires and patching holes even as they kept launching and landing planes off a deck that was still smoking at the edges. The Japanese reinforcement convoy, its cover shattered, turned back for Rabaul. In that single action, Fletcher's pilots shot down roughly 70 Japanese aircraft for a loss of about 20 of their own. And the enemy pilots lost in that exchange were men Japan could never fully replace: veteran carrier aviators, who had trained for years and could not simply be conjured up again the way a factory could turn out another airframe. It was a clear victory, Fletcher's third carrier battle in a row without a defeat, a record that in any other branch of the service, against any other set of critics, might have silenced the doubters for good. King's response was not gratitude. King criticized him for not turning to chase the retreating Japanese fleet into a night surface engagement against a force that still held every advantage in the dark, the same kind of night action that had just annihilated 4 Allied cruisers at Savo Island 2 weeks earlier. It did not seem to occur to King that the caution he was condemning in one breath was the same caution that might have saved 4 cruisers in the other. 1 week after that battle, on the 31st of August, the submarine I-26 found the Saratoga roughly 240 miles southeast of Guadalcanal and put a single torpedo into her starboard side. It flooded a fire room and knocked out her turbo-electric propulsion, the same mechanical weakness that had dogged that carrier's class for years and left her dead in the water. The heavy cruiser Minneapolis had to take her under tow, easing alongside in the swell to pass a line across while the crippled carrier sat low and motionless in the water. 12 men were wounded in the attack. None were killed, a small mercy given how easily it could have gone the other way. Fletcher himself was thrown against a fixture on the bridge by the force of the blast, his head cut open badly enough to need a bandage from a pharmacist's mate, an injury so minor by comparison to what he had already survived, at Veracruz under rifle fire, in convoy lanes stalked by submarines, across 3 carrier battles, that he would later be embarrassed to learn he had been awarded a Purple Heart for it. But his flagship was crippled and bound for the repair yard, and Fletcher was a wounded man who had spent nearly 9 straight months at sea in constant danger, almost without a single extended break, commanding 3 of the only 4 fleet carriers America had left in the entire Pacific Ocean, carrying a weight of responsibility that very few men in that war, on either side, were ever asked to carry for so long without relief. While all of this was happening, 6,000 miles from Washington, and completely outside the notice of the newspapers, a quieter kind of battle had already been decided. Back on the 18th of June, just after Midway, Raymond Spruance had left the sea and become Chester Nimitz's chief of staff at Pearl Harbor. It was a reward for what he had done in command of the Enterprise and Hornet Task Force, and it was also, whether anyone said so out loud or not, a promotion into the one place in the entire Pacific theater where a man's name stayed in front of the commander-in-chief every single day. While Fletcher spent the summer being shot at, torpedoed, and bombed across 3 separate carrier battles, Spruance was at Nimitz's elbow every single day, in the briefings, in the planning sessions, in the quiet after-hours conversations where the shape of the next 6 months of the war was being decided, becoming the trusted hand, the known and present quantity in the building where the decisions about who got the next command were actually made. A man at sea cannot make that kind of impression, no matter how many battles he wins. He can only send in his reports, weeks or months apart, and hope the men reading them back in Pearl Harbor remember what he looks like and what he has actually accomplished out there in the dark. Fletcher was winning battles at sea. Spruance was winning the argument at headquarters. And by the time Fletcher's crippled carrier finally limped back toward Pearl Harbor in September, exhausted, wounded, carrying 9 months of continuous combat on his shoulders, that quiet argument over who would command the Pacific War's carriers next had already been settled, without him ever knowing it was even taking place. Fletcher's flagship reached Pearl Harbor on the 21st of September 1942, towed most of the way, her crew exhausted, her admiral still nursing the cut on his head. Nimitz gave him his first leave of the entire war. There is evidence in the dispatch files that Nimitz, even then, still intended to bring Fletcher back to sea once the Saratoga was repaired, to give him another carrier task force and put him back in the fight where he had spent 9 straight months proving himself. But William Halsey, the aggressive aviator who had missed Midway lying in a hospital bed, was healthy again now, and the South Pacific was screaming for a commander with exactly his kind of fire. On the 18th of October, Halsey took over the entire South Pacific Command. Whatever plan there had been to bring Fletcher back quietly dissolved. Nobody relieved him. Nobody had to. They simply stopped calling. By November, his orders were for Seattle, and from there north, into the fog and freezing wind of the Aleutian Islands, where no Japanese carrier would ever sail and no battle worth the name would ever be fought. He would never command a carrier task force again for the rest of the war. So who actually made that decision, and why? There is no single memo in the archives where Ernest King writes the words "relieve Fletcher." It simply is not there. What is there instead is 9 months of quiet corrosion. King's furious message after the Marshall and Gilbert raids. His open doubts to Nimitz about trusting Fletcher with Coral Sea in the first place. His refusal to act on Nimitz's own recommendation that Fletcher be promoted and decorated after that battle. His preference for Halsey over Fletcher before Midway. His complaint, even after a third straight victory at the Eastern Solomons, that Fletcher had failed to chase the enemy into the dark. Some of this was policy. King was himself an aviator, having earned his wings late in life specifically to qualify for senior carrier command, and he was fiercely protective of that identity. It is worth remembering, though, that Nimitz himself was no stranger to the mercy of a second chance, and that his patience with Fletcher was not an accident of temperament. Back in 1908, as a young officer, Nimitz had run his own ship, the destroyer Decatur, hard aground, and had been court-martialed for it, a mistake that very nearly ended his career before it had properly begun. He was spared only because superiors chose to give him another chance, rather than bury him under the paperwork of that single failure. Nimitz never forgot what that mercy had meant to him, and it shaped how long he was willing to stand behind an officer who had made real contributions, even when that officer had also made real mistakes. For 9 months, that memory was the shield that kept Fletcher in command. Some of King's grudge, though, was simply personal. Fletcher was modest and plain-spoken to a fault. He once admitted with startling honesty that after any battle people like to talk about carefully reasoned decisions, when in truth there is always a great deal of groping around in the dark. That kind of honesty reads today as integrity. To a man like King, it read as weakness. Behind King stood the aviators, led by Admiral John Towers, who wanted Fletcher's job for one of their own, and who now had a story to justify it: the abandonment of the Marines at Guadalcanal. Towers wrote 3 words about Fletcher in his private diary. He ran away. Behind the aviators stood the Marine Corps itself, grieving and furious after months of hunger and fear on Guadalcanal, certain the Navy had left them to die on that beach. And behind all of them stood Samuel Eliot Morison, the historian who would write the official multi-volume account of the Navy's war, and who leaned heavily for his version of Guadalcanal on Kelly Turner, the single angriest man in the entire fleet where Fletcher was concerned. Morison never once interviewed Fletcher directly. The most influential written history of the war took its portrait of the Admiral largely from the words of the man who would later call him a deserter. Now weigh that against what the record actually shows. The charge that Fletcher abandoned the Marines at Savo Island does not survive contact with the timeline. His withdrawal order went out on the evening of the 8th of August. The disaster at Savo happened after midnight, hours later, and even if his carriers had stayed exactly where they were more than 100 miles from that anchorage. Carrier aircraft in 1942 could not fight at night. Mikawa's cruisers attacked in darkness precisely because he knew that once the sun rose, American aircraft would own the sky above his ships. Savo Island was a failure of surface screening and surface command, and it belonged to the men actually responsible for guarding that channel, not to an admiral and his flat tops sailing far to the south. As for the charge that Fletcher was simply too cautious by nature, consider the context nobody in Washington bothered to weigh. In August of 1942, the United States possessed exactly 4 fleet carriers in the entire Pacific Ocean. 3 of them were tied to Fletcher's flag. The next carrier in the pipeline, the USS Essex, had not even been commissioned yet, and would not fire a shot in anger for almost another year. Every carrier lost at Guadalcanal was, for all practical purposes, irreplaceable, and every pre-war exercise the Navy had ever run taught the same hard lesson, that a carrier tethered permanently to a beachhead was a dead carrier waiting for the enemy to find it. Fletcher's own subordinates agreed with him, and 15 months later, at the invasion of Tarawa, the admiral commanding the carriers there made the exact same decision Fletcher had made, refusing to keep his flat tops chained to the landing beaches. That admiral was Raymond Spruance, and for making Fletcher's call, Spruance was praised for his prudence and his operational wisdom. The identical judgment, from two officers who had both come up through battleships and cruisers rather than naval aviation, was called cowardice in one man and genius in the other. The only real difference between them was who was left to tell the story afterward, and whether that story was being written by an admirer sitting at the winner's elbow, or by an angry amphibious commander looking for someone to blame for a night he never should have had to survive. And whatever caution Fletcher carried into those decisions, it was not the caution of a frightened man. This was the same officer who had sailed a burning transport into Veracruz harbor under direct fire in 1914 to save more than 350 civilians, and earned the Medal of Honor for it. The same officer who had commanded a destroyer through submarine-infested convoy lanes in the First World War and won the Navy Cross. The record of his physical courage was never in question. What was actually in question, in the end, was whether the United States Navy of 1942 had room left for a battleship man in a chair the aviators had decided belonged to one of their own. It did not. By 1944, King made that shift official policy, ordering that any carrier or task force commander who was not himself an aviator had to have an aviator serving as chief of staff, a rule that quietly ended the careers of every remaining battleship admiral still holding a carrier command. Fletcher was simply the first prominent name the tide carried away. There is one more piece to this, and it is the part that makes the story genuinely sad rather than simply unjust. When the war ended, and the historians came looking for his side of it, Fletcher would not give it to them. He had lost most of his personal command papers when the Yorktown went down at Midway, and lost still more when he was carried wounded off the Saratoga. Rather than reconstruct events from memory and risk a single detail being wrong, he simply declined the interviews. He gave no speeches defending his record. He wrote no articles correcting the account. He let his critics tell the story for 50 years, because the same honesty and modesty that had made him hand the Midway battle to Spruance without hesitation also made him incapable of fighting for his own reputation. It took a historian, not an admiral, to finally reopen the case. In 2006, John Lundstrom published Black Shoe Carrier Admiral, built from decades spent inside the actual dispatch files and war diaries, and it turned 50 years of conventional wisdom on its head. The professional historians largely came around. The popular memory, the documentaries, and the easy summaries mostly never got the message. Frank Jack Fletcher served out the rest of the war commanding the quiet, frozen North Pacific Theater without complaint, the same way he had done everything else. He was the senior American officer present at the formal Japanese surrender in northern Japan in September of 1945. He retired a full admiral in 1947 and lived quietly for another quarter century, watching from a distance as the aviators he had once served beside rose to 5-star rank and had their portraits hung in wardrooms across the fleet. He died in 1973, remembered by most of the country, when he was remembered at all, as the admiral who ran. The record, when anyone actually bothers to read it closely, says otherwise. 3 carrier battles fought, across the most desperate and uncertain months of the entire Pacific War. 3 carrier battles won, every single one of them. 6 Japanese carriers sent to the bottom under his command against 2 American carriers lost, and no other admiral in that terrible first year of the Pacific War came anywhere close to that ledger. He did not lose the war for the United States Navy. In more ways than history has been willing to admit, he helped win it, and then he was quietly asked to disappear into the fog so that someone else could take the credit for finishing the job he started.